Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the American Embassy. My name is Richard. I am the Cultural Affairs Officer here at the Embassy. Owing to the current situation, we've had to temporarily close our Baku American Center and conduct no programming at any of our American corners throughout Azerbaijan. As a result, because we'd like to continue engaging with you and continue our conversations about American culture, American values, the United States, we have decided to start a virtual roadshow. We're going to be talking about various areas of interest, we think, to Azerbaijan and certainly to us. And today I'm very pleased to have with me our Community Liaison Officer, Rebecca, who's going to talk a little bit about her home state. Becky, good afternoon.
Thank you.
Very welcome. Before we begin talking about Minnesota, maybe would you like to just tell us a little bit about what you do at the embassy?
Sure. So Richard mentioned that I'm the Community Liaison Office Coordinator at the embassy here. So my job is to really help spouses and families of American officers settle into Azerbaijan to learn about schools and where they're going to be living. So one of the most fun things about my job is that I get to explore Baku and Azerbaijan a little bit to help other people to learn about food and culture and other exciting parts of living here for a couple of years.
Excellent. So we are going to now hear a little bit about Becky's home state, the great state of Minnesota, and we would encourage you to ask any questions at any point. You can ask questions through the comment section of this post or through Messenger, and we have a team here who's monitoring and will be passing the questions on to us. So with that, I will hand it over to Becky to talk a little bit about Minnesota.
So as Richard said, I'm going to be talking about my home state, Minnesota, which I believe is the best state, but Minnesotans are naturally quite modest, so we wouldn't say something like that, and I'm going to let you decide what you think of it. But I'm going to show you a map here to start. You'll see Minnesota here in the far northern part, center and northern part of the United States, right on the border with Canada. And I showed you the map because you are probably less familiar with Minnesota than you might be with some of the states on the east and the west coast. So to just give you a little bit of history, the first peoples that we know of in Minnesota were the Ojibwe and the Dakota Native American tribes, and there are still places and lakes and rivers in Minnesota that are named for these people, and there are still both Ojibwe and Dakota communities that are active in Minnesota today. So these are the first peoples, the Native American tribes in Minnesota, but Europeans started arriving around the 1650s. And the first Europeans who explored Minnesota were actually the French. And they didn't really settle there very much. They were mostly fur traders, but they did map out Minnesota, the land that would eventually become Minnesota, and claim the land for France. And we also have lots of cities and rivers that are named after the French explorers as well. But Minnesota would become part of the United States in 1803 through what is called the Louisiana Purchase. And this is when the United States bought a large part of central and western, what is now the United States, from France. So a large part of Minnesota was bought in that purchase as well. Minnesota would become a state in 1858, so it's a fairly young state. It was the 32nd state in the United States, and it's quite a bit younger than the East Coast states. So it's a newer part of the United States. And it was only after this time that a lot of Europeans, especially from Northern Europe, many from Scandinavia, began arriving in the U.S. Well, in what would become the state of Minnesota, or what was the state of Minnesota in the United States. This is a picture of loggers in the 1900s. A lot of immigrants came to Minnesota at the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s. Many of them came to take part in logging and in mining, and Minnesota also became an important agricultural state. As I said, many of them were from Northern Europe, so they were from cold, dark northern places, and that's sort of what Minnesota is like as well. So logging was important. Minnesota is well situated for something like logging. You see coming right down the middle of the United States here, the Mississippi River, which is one of the world's most important waterways. So its headwaters is in Minnesota, and that was important for logging because they could easily move those down the river and other products all the way to the Gulf of Mexico in the south. That logging tradition spurs some important cultural icons. One person or myth that's celebrated in Minnesota is Paul Bunyan and his huge, giant blue ox Babe. And this is actually a story that's popular, or that was popular across the United States, but Minnesotans have claimed it primarily to draw in tourists. So here we have a statue of Paul Bunyan in Bemidji, Minnesota. So there were stories about Paul Bunyan being such a huge logger that his breakfast skillet, he used men with grease on their feet to skate around his breakfast skillet in the morning when he was frying his eggs because he was so huge and ate so much. There's stories about Paul Bunyan creating the Grand Canyon with one sweep of his axe. So another important economic development was mining. Mining is really important, especially in northeastern Minnesota. This is a picture of the Hall Rust Pit, which is one of the world's largest open pit mines. My grandfather and most of my uncles at one point worked in this mine, which is right outside of Hibbing, Minnesota. And that was done, as I said, in northeastern Minnesota, which is on Lake Superior. So you see the city of Duluth right on the corner of Minnesota, on the edge of Lake Superior. Duluth became a really rich city at the beginning of the 20th century. It had apparently the most millionaires per capita of any city in the world because of mining. So they would do mining up in areas like Hibbing, up to the northwest of Duluth, and they could load up boats and ship iron ore all the way to places like Pittsburgh in the eastern United States to steel mills out there. So those were important for the early economy of Minnesota. But agriculture was also really important. This is a picture of Lake Superior. This is a really beautiful area. Lake Superior is very deep and very cold. You can't really go swimming in it, even in the hottest months of the summer, because it is so deep and cold. But this is a picture of a Split Rock Lighthouse near Duluth. It's a really, really pretty area with big bluffs, and there are often really big waves on this cold lake. But today, certainly the most important cities by far in Minnesota are Minneapolis and St. Paul, which are farther down the state. Bring the map back. This is Minneapolis and St. Paul. And in this area here, about 3/4 of the population of Minnesota lives, actually. So that is by far the most important urban area.
The Twin Cities.
The Twin Cities.
The capital.
St. Paul is the capital, but Minneapolis is actually the bigger city and probably more important economically. So these are home to the University of Minnesota, which is a highly ranked public university that has about 40,000 students. It's also home to Minnesota's beloved sports teams. So Minnesotans love, these are the Minnesota Vikings, our American football team, the Timberwolves, our basketball team, the Minnesota Wild, that's our ice hockey team, and then the Minnesota Twins. Minnesotans love their sports teams, and they always feel that they don't get enough respect from people on those east and west coasts of the United States who tend to overlook places like Minnesota. One sport that is really, really important for Minnesota is hockey. Again, that's the Minnesota Wild ice hockey team. Minnesota is known as the hockey capital of the United States. It has more hockey players, if you look at all levels, than any other state. It's a very serious business. So kids in Minnesota start playing ice hockey when they're 4 or 5, and even kids who are 7 or 8 years old play hockey year-round. It's a really serious business, very, very competitive. And I have a picture here. Women's hockey and girls hockey have also become really popular and important in Minnesota in recent years, probably since the 1990s or so. It makes sense that something like hockey would be popular because Minnesota has a lot of ice, it has a lot of water, it has a lot of ice, and it is a very cold state. We complain about the cold in Minnesota all the time, but we also kind of celebrate it. Just to give you a sense of how bad it can be, the coldest temperature ever recorded in Minnesota was in Tower, Minnesota, which isn't far from Duluth, which I showed you up on the map. And that in 1996, the temperature reached 60 below Fahrenheit, which is about 51 below centigrade. That was in 1996. So it can get pretty bad. The winters are also very long. January is the coldest month. The average temperature at night is minus 15 centigrade in January. But like I said, we complain about it, but we also celebrate it. This is a picture of a high school Nordic skiing team. This is also a popular sport in Minnesota. And then this is a picture of ice fishing derby. Ice fishing is a popular sport in Minnesota. People cut a hole in the ice and sit around it in a shack and go fishing. This is a derby, so it's a competition. And you can see, in case it's not clear, this is the lake, and those are cars and houses out on the lake. By the middle of winter, it's been cold long enough that the ice is, very, very thick, and you can easily drive across it and bring lots of big machinery onto it without it being a problem. So this is a map that shows you how much of Minnesota is covered by water. Minnesota is known as the land of 10,000 lakes, but most Minnesotans will probably very early on tell you that there's actually about 12,000. We're very proud of the number of lakes that we have and the lakeside recreation. I showed you ice fishing, but lakes are really important in the summer. A lot of people who live in the cities also have connections up north, as we would say, in the small towns in northern Minnesota. So a lot of people go up to their lake cabins on the weekends to go swimming or boating or fishing. There are still these important connections between the city and the small towns. For example, both of my parents are from northern Minnesota, so we have a cabin that we go up to, and my parents are at most of the summer, a cabin on the lake.
Pretty.
Okay, so I just wanted to finish by talking about the fact that Minnesota does have these small town connections, but it also has these big cities and famous people. Some of you may know Prince or know his music. He's one of our more famous and most celebrated, or was one of our most famous and celebrated musicians. Minneapolis in particular has an important music scene. As I said, we have a world-class university there. There are big museums that are important. But we also still have these small-town connections that I think are important for influencing culture in the state. And I'm going to finish by talking to you about one of my favorite things to do that sort of gets at this connection, and that is to go to the Minnesota State Fair, which happens every year at the end of August. And it's really important for marking the end of summer. So the State Fair is an agricultural tradition where people would celebrate the end of the agricultural year. It ends the first weekend in September, and right after that, everybody goes back to school. So these are state fairs are events that became popular in the U.S. in the mid-1800s. There are also county fairs and town fairs, but people would bring their prize animals to be judged, and this is something that still happens at the state fair. So this boy is competing in some kind of competition at the fair. And one of the things that they also do at the state fair every year, because Minnesota has a big dairy industry, they have a beauty contest at the fair, and the girl who wins the contest is named Princess Kay of the Milky Way, and every year she has her head sculpted in butter and exhibited at the fair. But this is a big event. We call it the Great Minnesota Get Together. Everybody goes to the fair. You eat lots of unhealthy foods like donuts and corn dogs, lots of food on a stick. Lots of kids work at the fair. I worked at the fair and made pancakes one summer. But I think it sort of gets at the fact that while Minnesota does have these big cities and important museums and culture and all of that, this agricultural identity is also still a part, and there are also these connections to the rural past and present.
Sounds a little bit like Azerbaijan in that way.
I guess that's true.
Very good. Is that the?
Yeah, that's the end of my presentation.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that's excellent, Becky. I wondered, I would like to start. I have a question. Is there, and then we'd love to get the questions from the audience as well. Is there a Minnesota state food other than butter, I guess?
I don't know if there's an official Minnesota state food, but one of the things that we are proud of is our wild rice, which is something that I don't think is grown in many other parts of the United States. I think it's grown in parts of Canada, but this is also actually a Native American product that was grown by the Ojibwe and is still grown in the northeastern part of Minnesota.
Oh, fantastic. Do we have any questions from the audience, Adon?
Yeah, we have some.
Oh, may I hear? Thank you very much. Okay, now these came from chat. So, somebody's asking, what does Minnesota, the name, mean?
This is also something that comes out of that Native American history. Minnesota means the land of sky blue waters in Ojibwe.
Oh, excellent, very pretty. And Aliev F asks via chat, how is immigration changing Minnesota?
That's a very good question because I've talked mostly about the history of Minnesota and the importance of immigrants from Northern Europe, especially from Scandinavia. And Minnesota has a lot of more recent immigrants that are making it a more multicultural state, and especially making the Twin Cities a multicultural area. Two groups that are really important are the Hmong immigrants. Minnesota has, I believe, the biggest Hmong community outside. Hmong is an ethnic group from Vietnam and Laos. And Minnesota has the largest community outside of Southeast Asia, I believe. And then another group that's becoming really important is the Somali community. We have a lot of Somali immigrants, and we actually have now the first Somali representative to Congress, who is actually a Somali woman.
Oh, excellent. Very interesting. I see A. Oscarova asks, what are Minnesota's biggest inventions?
This is actually a small invention that's really important. One of Minnesota's biggest companies is called 3M, which means Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, which produces a lot of different things. But one of the things that probably most people use in their daily lives is Scotch tape that was invented at Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, which my father actually worked at for about 40 years.
Really?
But another really important invention, well-known invention, I guess, of 3M is Post-it notes, the little sticky notes that people write on and use to leave themselves notes everywhere. an invention of the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company as well.
3M, oh, fantastic. Is golf popular in Minnesota?
Um, I guess
One month of summer anymore.
I guess it's sort of popular in the summer, but I think probably less popular than states that have green space for a longer part of the year.
Okay.
You're limited
Excellent.
in how often you can go golfing.
Well, those are all the questions we have. Are there any others coming in? Okay. Maybe one last question. Are there any famous Minnesotans that people should know about, or Azerbaijani friends would maybe have heard of?
Well, I showed you Prince on the
You did.
the presentation here. Some of you might have heard of Bob Dylan, although maybe younger people won't be as familiar with him.
He just won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I think, didn't he?
I did not realize that.
I think he did.
He is a famous poet as well as musician, I guess. Another famous person that Azerbaijanis might have heard of is Brock Lesnar, who wrestled for the University of Minnesota. I know wrestling is popular here. It's also very popular in Minnesota.
Oh, and he went on to be a mixed martial art fighter. Is that right?
So.
Oh, he is an artist after all, isn't he? Just a rather rougher nature. Okay, well, if we don't have any more, okay. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. I didn't see that. Does Minnesota have a rivalry with any other state?
I would say that Minnesotans have the biggest rivalry with Wisconsin, which is our neighbor to the east, and that's a very big sports rivalry. There's a huge rivalry between the Minnesota Vikings and the Green Bay Packers, which are a football team in Wisconsin. So that's a big rivalry, mostly sports. Minnesotans tend to pick on people from Iowa a lot, which is our neighbor to the south. I wouldn't say it's a rivalry because Minnesotans feel themselves to be superior usually to
that modesty you were telling us about. Excellent.
Those are our biggest rivals.
Okay. Is there
Yeah, there's one question about how historical Minnesota is as a state. Does it have a lot of historical monuments, I believe?
That's a good question. I would say there aren't a lot of historical monuments. We have some important military installations. Fort Snelling is a fort that you can still go visit. I think they've made it into a living history fort where you can see how people lived when Minnesota was first settled.
And that's right on the Mississippi River.
That's right on the Mississippi River and dates to the period right after the Louisiana Purchase when the area became part of the United States. But like I said, Minnesota is kind of a young state compared to East Coast states, and immigration from Europe happened there much later than it did on the East Coast.
Charles Lindbergh, was he a Minnesota?
Charles Lindbergh is from Sauk Center, Minnesota.
The first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean.
Lucky Lindy?
Lucky
Or Little
Lindy.
Falls, Minnesota. He's from Little Falls. That's right.
Important distinction. Very good. Excellent. I think we have one more question
We
coming.
have the question about the differences and similarities between Azerbaijani and Minnesota people.
Oh, fantastic.
That's interesting. I would say that from my experience so far living in Azerbaijan, Azerbaijanis have all been warm and welcoming to us when we've arrived here. And that's something that people say about Minnesotans as well. We like to talk about what we call Minnesota nice. The Minnesotans are more friendly and smiley and welcoming than people in other parts of the United States. And I think that that's something that I've felt so far in Azerbaijan.
Oh, fantastic.
There's a question about what is a must-visit place in Minnesota?
A must visit. Well, the Twin Cities are definitely the center of Minnesota in a lot of ways, but it sort of depends on what you would like to do. If you like nature, you would want to visit one of the lakes in the summer, one of our small towns, and there are lots and lots of beautiful lakes and little towns and country areas to visit. I also showed you the city of Duluth, which is on Lake Superior, which I think is a beautiful city and a must-see for people who come to spend any amount of time in Minnesota.
Very good. Have either of you any questions you'd like to ask about Minnesota? I think these are all the questions our audience members have asked. But one last question I would ask is, do you think you will live in Minnesota again?
Well, that is a good question. I don't know. My son would like to live in Minnesota. He talks about it all the time. When you ask him where his favorite place in the world, he would always say Minnesota. And so he's always hoping that they will start an embassy there, which obviously isn't going to happen. And because of that, I think that I am unlikely to live there in the future. But I definitely plan to visit at least every year.
Okay, very good. Well, that's great then. Well, Becky, on behalf of our virtual American Roadshow audiences, thank you very much. And thank all of you for joining in. This will be on our Facebook page, the Baku American Center Facebook page, as well as the Facebook, the American Corner Facebook pages. You'll be able to watch it again. And we will be having more programming on of this variety. On Friday at 4 o'clock, our visiting Fulbright scholar, Judith Ogden, is going to be talking about her hometown, Atlanta, capital of the New South. But for now, thank you so much for joining us. And if you have any suggestions about programming you'd like to see us do, please write it in the comments section, and we'll try to get a member of the embassy community or one of our visiting scholars or English teaching assistants to talk about that. It could be anything from a state, a sport, something about America. Thank you very much, and we'll be seeing you again soon. Bye then.